Order. Order. Question number 2. Order. I've called James Shaw. Question number 2.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues. Does the Government agree with the conclusions and the recommendations in the vivid report Net Zero in New Zealand, Scenarios to Achieve Domestic Emissions Neutrality in the Second Half of the Century?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr Speaker, I think the vivid report is a valuable contribution to the debate about how best to tackle climate change. But it looks very long-term and also doesn't set out the costs of the various forms of reducing or offsetting emissions that it suggests. We need to look at that before we will know the combination of policies which will be best for New Zealand.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does she agree with the first conclusion that staying within 2 degrees of global warming will require New Zealand getting to 98% renewable energy by 2050, as well as 85% uptake of electric vehicles?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
We already have a target of 90% renewable energy, which compared to other countries is very high. I'm advised that anything above 90% will mean we would need to have a lot more backup generation available. So whilst I don't disagree, I'm also excited about perhaps technology improvements that might come as well.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does she agree with the second conclusion that staying within 2 degrees of global warming will require an alteration to our land use patterns, even if all of the scientific and technological research on reducing animal emissions is successful and fully implemented?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Speaker, I certainly agree that we need to plant more trees and that that's an important part of how we look at our of tackling climate change in the future. But we simply don't know what technological advances there will be in that case, and we will be making in the next decades on agricultural emissions.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does she agree with the report's first recommendation that a higher, more predictable price on emissions would help to avoid locking in high emissions infrastructure that makes it impossible to get to a low emission economy? And would she consider removing the current $25 a tonne price cap?
Mr.
The
Speaker,
Honourable Paula Bennett.
To the first part, yes, and that's why we removed the 2 for 1. And we've already seen the first third come off and that people will be paying the full emissions. As far as the cap is concerned, that is part of the ETS Phase 2 and that is being considered.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Would she agree with recommendation 2 that putting a price on biological emissions from agriculture would encourage land use decisions that takes emissions intensity into account?
The
Mr.
Honourable
Speaker.
Paula Bennett.
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe we should be bringing agriculture into the ETS at this time. As I've said, we need to balance the need to reduce emissions with the fact that our farmers are so important to global food supply and, in fact, at this time feed more than 40 million people around the world.
Good answer.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does she agree with recommendation 9 that an area for further policy development is addressing the distributional implications of differing low emission scenarios? In other words, a just transition to protect people's incomes and livelihoods?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I do. I do agree with that. I think we need to look at what the offsets are, what the real costs are, and how we can get that right balance.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does she agree with recommendation 6 for an independent climate commission based on the UK model to guide policy settings towards a net zero carbon economy?
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr. Speaker, no, I don't agree with that at this time. I think the UK were at a different place on climate change when they did it, but I must say that this report and the work that's going on with Globe New Zealand leads us to more of an all-of-Parliament approach that I think is really important for this debate.
Question number 3, Chris Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.